Chapter 1 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Tuktu and Aklok. Tuktu was a little Eskimo girl. Tuktu means caribou. She had been given this name because only a few days before her birth, a relative named Tuktu had died, and, as is the custom, this name had been given to the baby. She was well named, for caribou were to have much to do with her life. On the very day that she was born, Kutok, her father, had killed a caribou when food was greatly needed. That year, for some unknown reason, caribou had moved from their usual feeding grounds, and Kutok and his family had had to depend almost wholly on seal and polar bear, and these had been none too plentiful. So this caribou had brought great joy to the home of Kutok. In the days following, he found the caribou back in their old feeding grounds. Later, Kutok was to become a herder of reindeer, and the reindeer, you know, are the first cousins of the caribou. So it was that Tuktu was well named. Aklok, her brother, bore the name of the Great Brown Bear. Aklok was 2 years older than Tuktu and gave promise of being like his father, a mighty hunter. Already he had killed his seal, and none knew better than he how to snare the ptarmigan. In the summer, he and Tuktu gathered eggs when the waterfowl came north in untold thousands for the nesting. Whatever Aklok did, Tuktu tried to do. While the children were still small, their father had become a herder of reindeer, and the little folk spent much of their time with the deer. They helped herd them. They did their part at the annual roundup. In the spring, they hunted for stray calves that had lost their mothers. Both learned to drive deer to a sled. During the long winter nights, the herders often gathered in Kutok's house, and there they told stories while the children listened. There were stories of hunting, stories of adventure, stories of many strange things. But the story that Tuktu and Aklok liked the best of all was that of the chosen deer of the Valley of the Good Spirit. This was especially true of Tuktu. She used to dream of that wonderful valley, and whenever she saw the northern lights, the aurora, shooting up high overhead, she would wonder what would happen to anyone who might stray into that valley, for it was said that it was from this valley that those lights came. At last there came a time when she and Aklok actually were to live for a week or two almost on the border of that valley. Do you wonder that she tingled clear to the tips of her fingers and toes with little thrills of anticipation, excitement, and perhaps just a wee bit of fear? It was the fulfillment of a promise that their father had made them, that when the deer moved over from their summer feeding grounds to the Valley of the Good Spirit, they should go with him to keep watch from a distance. Even Aklok was excited, though he did his utmost not to appear so, and trudged along behind his father as if visiting the Valley of the Good Spirit were an everyday affair. All day they traveled. That is, they traveled what would have been all day where you and I live. It wasn't all day there, for you know, way up in the north, there is no real night in summer. At last they reached the hut in which they were to live while the deer grazed on the hills of the Valley of the Good Spirit. This hut was a very rude affair, built partly in the ground and partly on the ground. It was of wood and stone, with a skin roof and a long entrance passage. While not as big and comfortable as the house at home, it was the sort of thing these children were used to, and it was quite good enough. That night, after the evening meal, Tuktu begged her father to once more tell the story of the Valley of the Good Spirit and of the chosen reindeer. "Why is it called the Valley of the Good Spirit?" she asked. "Because," replied Kutok, "a wonderful and good spirit lives and moves there." "Has anyone ever seen him?" Aklok asked. "No," replied Kutak, "none but the deer people, and of these only the chosen ones ever go down into that valley. But we know that a good spirit lives there, for always the deer that graze on the hills about the valley are safe from the wolf, the bear, and all other enemies. They do not need to be watched. There need be no herder here, were it not that it is well to know when the herd moves out, for then the summer grazing is over. It is a good spirit, for is it not true that every year 8 deer are chosen, and the next year returned to us the finest sled deer in all the north? The good spirit dwells there, and with him live many lesser spirits who do his bidding." Thus it was that Kutak told the children of what you and I know as fairies and elves and gnomes and trolls. Eskimo children know nothing about these little unseen people. To them, all are spirits. "Have you ever looked down into the valley?" asked Aklak. "No," replied Kutak. "It is not well to be curious. I am content to stay here and wait for the deer to move. So must you be." "What would happen if one should venture down into the valley?" asked Aklak. "That no man knows, for no man has ever been so bold as to even think of doing such a thing," replied his father. "My son, be wise with the wisdom of your elders, and be satisfied. None but the deer folk ever enter that valley, and these only the chosen ones. We will stay here, and from a distance watch the herd." "If it is such a good spirit," thought Tuktu, although she didn't venture to express her thought aloud, "why should anyone fear to go down into the valley?" And she was still wondering as she fell asleep. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Kringle Valley. For the greater part of the short Arctic summer, the great herd of reindeer had grazed within the sound of the waters of the Arctic Ocean lapping on the beach. More than 2,000 deer were in that herd. They were not all Kutak's, although all were in his charge, for he was the chief herder. Only about 200 of the deer were his, as shown by the ear marks. It was in deer that Kutak was paid for his services in looking after the great herd, which was owned by white men. With the approach of the long winter, the deer would move inland to winter range, and Kutak and his family would return to their permanent home. For several days before the opening of this story, the deer had been uneasy. They had done more or less milling. This means that they had gathered in a great body, the outer members traveling in a large circle and trotting tirelessly most of the time. Kutak knew the sign. "They will soon seek the Valley of the Good Spirit," said he to the other herders who assisted him. That very afternoon, the herd, as if at a signal from some wise old leader, began to move inland. In a short time, all the deer but the trained pack animals, which had been fastened, had disappeared. It was then that Kutak had taken Tuktu and Aklak to the hut not far from the entrance to the Valley of the Good Spirit. It was the greatest event in the lives of these two little Eskimo folk, for always they had heard this valley spoken of with awe that was almost reverence. Now perhaps they might be permitted to see the wondrous colored mists that were said to rise from it. Kringle Valley was the name by which it was known to the white men, none of whom believed in it, for none had ever seen it. But to the Eskimos it was, as I have already stated, the Valley of the Good Spirit. Did they not know that on its gentle slopes wild grasses grew in such abundance and such richness as could be found nowhere else in all the north? Were not the hillsides carpeted with wild flowers until they glowed in patches of brilliant color? You see, even the Arctic has its summer. It is a short summer, but a wonderful summer. Up there above the Arctic Circle, there are days when the sun does not set at all, and the number of days during which the sun does not set increases as one goes north, until at the North Pole there are 6 months and 5 days of continuous daylight. When the sun does set for a few hours, the twilight is so brilliant that it is difficult to think of the day as having ended when the sun disappears. Kringle Valley is a valley of mystery. No man as yet has been privileged to enter it. No man has even looked down into it, save from a distance. It is said to be filled with a soft, many-colored mist, which is neither of dampness nor of smoke. The Eskimos believe it to be the birthplace of the ever-changing, many-colored lights of the aurora. Only the herders of the reindeer, which yearly seek pasturage on the hills around the valley, have ever ventured near enough to see even from a distance the curtain of many-colored mist. Around the winter firepots the story is told to the children of how every year, just before the great herd leaves the valley, the deer gather at the upper end and there, for a time, mill. There is no fear among these milling deer as they trot tirelessly in a huge circle. There is a constant shifting until in turn each of the bucks has made at least one circuit in the outer ring. Thus, each has a chance to show his full strength and beauty. From time to time, as at a signal, one of these trotting deer leaves the circle and stands motionless just without the curtain of colored mist. When 8 have been thus chosen, they disappear in single file into the mist of the valley, while the leaders of the great herd at once start the southern migration, and the herders know that no longer will the deer feed in Kringle Valley until toward the end of another summer. And the herders know, too, that when the winter roundup in the corrals is made for the yearly count, the 8 best sled deer in all the herds will be missing. They will be the ones which vanished into the shimmering mists of Kringle Valley, and the herders whose deer have so disappeared will rejoice greatly. They will be counted as being blessed above their fellows. They know that their deer are not lost. They know that when once again the great herd moves to Kringle Valley, they will find there the 8 deer, fat, sleek, well cared for. They know that these deer thereafter will never mingle with the herd, but will be for as long as they live the finest sled deer in all the world. So it is considered good fortune if, after the herd leaves Kringle Valley, one's deer be found missing. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Tuktu's Soft Heart. These were happy days for Tuktu and Aklok. Tuktu's only duties were to cook meals for her father and brother. An Eskimo girl learns these things very young, and Tuktu had been well taught. Aklok spent most of his time hunting. Their father did little but sit for long hours, smoking and watching the distant hillsides where the reindeer grazed above the valley of the Good Spirit. These were lazy, happy days, and Kutak was making the most of them, for the summer was nearly at an end, and he knew that when the herd moved, there would be little time for lazing. Tuktu roamed about picking the flowers that grew in such profusion, and also hunting for the flocks of young ptarmigan, for she dearly loved to watch these pretty chickens of the north. Not for all the world would Tuktu have harmed one of them. Not for the world would she have told her brother Aklok how she felt when he brought in ptarmigan and other birds for the cooking pot. But despite the fact that she ate them and enjoyed the eating, there was all the time in her heart a wee feeling of sadness, for Tuktu's heart was the loving heart. Aklok was a good herder and had a way with the deer which some of the older herders might well have envied. but there was no one among all the herders or families who could go among the deer as freely and unnoticed as could Tuktu. It was as if she held some strange power over the deer people, as if they had accepted her as one of their own number. She could approach the most timid and nervous among the wilder members of the big herds. As for the sled deer, they might balk and strike at others, but never at Tuktu when she harnessed them. She loved them every one, and seemingly they knew it. So it was that Tuktu found her playmates among the wild people, who were not wild with her. Many a time had she stroked a ptarmigan on the nest. Many a time had the Arctic hare fed from her fingers. The seafowl paid no attention to her. Love has a strange way of making itself felt among the wild folk, and the soft heart of Tuktu was soft because of love. So it was that when she found the home of a blue fox, about the entrance to which 4 half-grown little foxes were playing, she did not tell her brother. Each day she would steal away and sit by the entrance to the den, taking with her bits of meat for the little foxes. How she loved to see them roll and tumble about her feet. Sometimes 2 of them would get hold of the same piece of meat, and then there would be a tug of war. Tuktu's eyes would dance and she would laugh softly. And then, when one little fox had succeeded in pulling the meat from the other, she would give the loser the extra piece which she always had for that purpose. And a short distance away sat Mother Fox, grinning happily. While she picked the flowers and played with the foxes and now and then mothered a young ptarmigan that had been lost from the flock, she dreamed of the Valley of the Good Spirit. It seemed such a little distance to the brow of the nearest hill overlooking that valley that she couldn't help but wonder what she would see if she should climb up there. But not once did the thought of really doing it enter her head. It was enough for Tuktu that it was forbidden. It was not that she was afraid. She knew that her father was afraid. She knew that Aklak was afraid. She knew that they regarded the Good Spirit and the valley where he lived with reverence and awe. But Tuktu was not afraid. It was enough for her that the Valley of the Good Spirit was sacred and not to be approached by other than the deer people. So, no matter how great her longing to look down from that hilltop, the thought of actually trying to do such a thing never entered her wildest dreams. She would sit for hours looking over toward the valley and wondering what the deer folk saw therein. Now and again she could see the deer moving on the upper hills. Once, as she was watching them, she said softly, for she had a way of talking to herself, "I wish I really were a Tuktu, a caribou." "Why?" asked Aklak, who had stolen softly up behind her, just in time to hear what she said. "Because then I might go into the Valley of the Good Spirit, and I might even be chosen by the Good Spirit. Who knows?" Aklak laughed, but it was a good-natured laugh. "It is the reindeer, not the caribou, who go down into the valley," said he. "But the caribou go too," replied Tuktu quickly, "for only this morning I saw a band of them heading that way, and after all the reindeer are but tame caribou." "You saw a band this morning?" exclaimed Aklak excitedly, for all that morning he had been hunting for caribou and had not seen one. Tuktu nodded. "Yes," said she, "and Aklak, I'm glad you didn't see them. I am glad they have gone where you cannot follow, for I would not like to have a caribou killed here so near to the Valley of the Good Spirit." Aklak opened his mouth for a quick retort, then thought better of it. Perhaps, after all, Tuktu was right. Perhaps it were better that there should be no killing of the deer folk so near the Valley of the Good Spirit. He remembered that not even the wolves nor the great brown bear for whom he was named ever killed there. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of the Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Whitefoot Goes Astray. The 2 pack deer with which Kutok had moved up near the valley of the Good Spirit had been kept fastened, each with a long rawhide line. But Kutok well knew that should they be allowed to go free, they would be likely to join the herds over on the hills above the valley. So they were kept tethered by long lines, and each day were moved to a new grazing ground. Sometimes Kutok attended to this, sometimes Aklak. It happened one day that both Kutok and Aklak had gone hunting. Tuktu was not at all lonely, for loneliness is something that Eskimo folk know little about. Had she not the 2 deer for company, to say nothing of the little foxes with whom she played daily? It was nothing new for her to be left alone while her father and brother went hunting. It was Aklak who had moved the deer to new grazing ground just before starting that morning. 2 or 3 times Tuktu wandered over to pat them and pet them, as was her habit. When she became sleepy, she lay down for a nap. It was when she awoke from this that she discovered one of the deer had pulled the peg by which he had been fastened, and had wandered away. It must be that Aklak was in too much of a hurry when he drove that peg, thought Tuktu. I must find Whitefoot and bring him back, or father will be very angry. He will blame Aklak, and it will be very unpleasant to have only 1 deer when it is time to move. Yes, I must find Whitefoot and bring him back. Whitefoot was the deer's name, for his off forefoot was white. Having often helped in the rounding up of strays from the herd, Tuktu was skilled in reading signs. Almost at once she found traces of the wandering Whitefoot. He was grazing as he moved along, taking a bit now on this side and now on that side. Once she found a little bush in which the dragging peg had become entangled. Whitefoot had broken the branches of the bush in tearing himself free. Tuktu hurried on, for she saw that the course was leading toward the hills above the valley of the Good Spirit. I must catch him before he gets much farther, thought Tuktu as she hurried on. Father was right. Whitefoot is doing just what father said the deer would do if they should be free. He is going to join the great herd. I must get him before he gets there, or we shall see no more of him until the herd moves out from the valley. It was warm work, for in summer it becomes unpleasantly hot, even way up there in the Northland. Tuktu was panting and perspiring, and she was growing tired, but not for an instant did she delay. I must get him, she kept saying over and over. I must get Whitefoot. At last, from a little rise of ground, she saw the wanderer just going up a little hill. Whitefoot, she called. Whitefoot, stop, Whitefoot. At the sound of her voice, Whitefoot lifted his head and looked back. Whitefoot, Whitefoot, she called, hurrying forward. Whitefoot hesitated. He looked back in the direction in which he had been traveling. Somewhere ahead of him was the great herd. The scent of it was borne to him on the wind. The longing to join it was almost irresistible. Behind him rang the commands of the little mistress he had learned to love and obey. Stop, Whitefoot, stop! His nose demanded obedience to the call of the herd. His ears demanded obedience to the command of his little mistress. Which should he obey? No wonder Whitefoot hesitated. It was not for nothing that Tuktu was known among her companions as Little Fleetfoot. She was out of breath, she was tired, and she was, oh, so hot. But despite all this, she ran now as if she were running a race. Just as Whitefoot decided that the call of the herd must be heeded, Tuktu threw herself forward on the dragging peg at the end of the long line which trailed behind Whitefoot. The decision was no longer his. Tuktu had won. Holding fast to the line, Tuktu seated herself in the grass and slowly drew the reluctant Whitefoot toward her. All the time she talked to him, chiding him for wandering away, telling him how necessary he was, calling him names of endearment in one breath and scolding him in the next. Whitefoot stamped once or twice impatiently. Then, as if having made up his mind that he might as well make the best of the matter, he fell to grazing. For a long time Tuktu sat there, for, as I have said, she was tired. At last she arose. "Whitefoot," she said severely, "you have made me run a long way. Now you will have to carry me back." As you know, Whitefoot was a pack animal. He had been trained to carry loads on his back. Tuktu had ridden him many times, so it was nothing new for him to feel his little mistress on his back. She turned his head toward camp, and then she saw the white, thick mist of the Arctic fog rolling in from the coast. Already it had almost reached them. End of Chapter 4. Read by Ted Perkins, Côte St. Luc, Canada, July 2022.
Chapter 5 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 5. Lost in the Fog. In from the distant sea rolled the Arctic fog. It was as if one of those great white fleecy clouds you have seen sailing high in the sky had come to earth and was being pushed forward to bury everything in its fleecy depths. Tuktu urged Whitefoot forward in the swinging trot the reindeer know. Would he be able to get her to camp before that swiftly moving fog bank would cut off all sight in any direction? She knew all about the fogs of the far Northland. Had she been at home, she would not have minded it, but to be caught far from the camp was another matter. "But I can trust Whitefoot," thought Tuktu. "The deerfolk can find their way even though they cannot see. So long as I am safe on the back of Whitefoot, I need not worry. Whitefoot is heading the right direction, and he will take me safely back." The soft mist swirled about them, and Tuktu could see nothing. She could see nothing, and she could hear nothing but the clicking of Whitefoot's feet. There was no other sound. It was as if she and Whitefoot were alone in a white, wet world of silence. Click, 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 click sounded Whitefoot's feet, a click with every step. It was comforting to hear that much, for each click meant a forward step, and each forward step meant so much nearer to the camp. At least, that is what Tuktu encouraged herself by thinking. "I wonder where Father and Aklock are," she thought. "This fog must have caught them first, for they were hunting in the direction of the seacoast. They must have seen it coming and probably made camp. They will stay there until the fog lifts. If only I were back at the camp, I would not mind it a bit. Trot, Whitefoot, trot. Remember that Tuktu's on your back and she wants to go home." Whitefoot did trot. He trotted steadily despite the fact that he could see nothing. His head was carried forward and his nose out and his nostrils were extended. With every breath he was testing the damp air. By the motion, Tuktu could tell when he was going up a hill and when he started going down again. She was enjoying the ride. But there came a time when Tuktu began to wonder. "We should be there by this time," she thought. "Yes, indeed, we should be there by this time. Whitefoot has been traveling so fast that I'm sure we should have been home long ago. If he did not trot along so steadily, I should think he were lost and wandering about, but he seems to know just where he is going. Oh dear, I wish I could see just a little way. Whitefoot, what is that?" Whitefoot stopped abruptly. Through the mist at one side a dim form moved. Tuktu gave a little sigh of thankfulness and was about to drop to the ground, for she was sure that this was the other pack deer that had been left grazing near the camp. But she didn't drop, for she became aware that another dim form was on the other side of her, and then she heard the muffled click, click, click of many feet, a sound that could be heard only where many deer were near. Too often had she listened to it to not know that she was now in the midst of a herd. She heard the click in front, behind, and on both sides, and as she strained her eyes could see dim shapes appear and disappear on all sides. "Whitefoot," she whispered, "Whitefoot, where have you taken me?" She wondered if by chance some other herd of reindeer had moved in from the seacoast on its way to the Valley of the Good Spirit. She wondered if it might be that she was in the midst of a band of caribou. She decided that this must be it. Probably Whitefoot had smelled or perhaps heard them, so had joined them. She was not afraid. Did she not know that the reindeer are the most gentle of animals? Had she not lived with them and loved them from babyhood? She would remain on Whitefoot's back and hope that the fog would lift soon. If it did not, she would stop Whitefoot and push the peg into the ground to fasten him. Then they would remain there together until such time as the fog should disappear. There was only one thing that worried Tuktu. If she had to remain there long, what should she eat? But even this did not greatly worry her, for she was sure that the fog would last but a little while, and she knew that they could not be far from camp. Whitefoot no longer was trotting, nor were any of the other deer folk. All seemed to be grazing, moving along slowly as they grazed. Tuktu became drowsy. Once or twice she nodded, and the wonder was that she didn't slip from Whitefoot's back. And all about her there was the gentle click, 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 click of moving feet, and now and then the soft intake of breath and the gentle sniff of grazing deer. End of Chapter 5. Read by Gray Older. Chapter 6 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 6. The Awakening of Tuktu. Unafraid, Tuktu rode in the midst of the great herd. How long it was before she had a chance to slip from Whitefoot's back, she had no idea. But presently, from sundry sounds, dull but unmistakable, which reached her through the fog, she knew that the deer were bedding down. They were lying down to chew the cud, as you have so often seen cattle do. Whitefoot stopped. Tuktu slipped from his back. A moment later, Whitefoot lay down. Tuktu snuggled up against his back. Despite the dampness of the fog, she was conscious of a pleasant warmth. In a few minutes she was asleep. Tuktu was awakened by the sound of a bell. She knew it was a bell because she had once heard a bell on a ship which had come in close to the shore when they were camped there. But this bell was sweeter far than had been the bell on the ship, though that had seemed the most wonderful sound that she and Auklok had ever heard. Slowly she opened her eyes. Abruptly she sat upright and rubbed both eyes with her knuckles. Her first thought was that she was still in the fog. But when she looked up, she saw there was neither fog nor cloud. It was only when she looked below that she saw a fog, and this fog was not like any fog she had ever known. It was a mist of many colors that shimmered and blended and parted and flashed, as she had so often seen the northern lights or aurora do in the winter. And somehow, hidden by that wondrous colored mist, was that silver bell. Do you wonder that Tuktu rubbed her eyes? She was on the slope of a great hill. All about her, contentedly chewing their cuds, were the deer people. As far as she could see in either direction, and across on the sides of the opposite hill, the deer lay. She knew that not only was Kutok's herd here, but also many other herds. Never had she seen such rich pasture. Never had she seen such flowers. And there were great masses of reindeer moss, lichens, showing the season's growth. No wonder the deer people sought the hillsides of this wondrous valley. She caught her breath. It had come to her where she was. She knew that she was with the herd on one of the slopes of the Valley of the Good Spirit. It was just as she had heard it described around the winter firepots, only far more beautiful. Tuktu rubbed her eyes and rubbed her eyes. Perhaps this was only a dream. She put out her hand. There was Whitefoot contentedly chewing his cud, and Whitefoot was no dream. He was real, for even as she touched him, he bent his head and gently scratched one of his antlers with the point of a hind hoof. Again she heard the soft, clear, silvery notes of that hidden bell. Then clearly, though faintly, she heard many other sounds. There was the blowing of trumpets, the beating of drums, fairy music coming from the heart of that wonderful mist below her, and the mist itself. Never had she seen anything so beautiful. All the colors of the rainbow, all the wondrous colors of the sunset, all the shooting, flashing fires of the aurora seemed mingled there. Tuktu knew that she ought to be afraid. Had not her father said that only from a distance had any man looked into that wondrous valley? Had she not seen fear in his eyes at the mere mention of the Valley of the Good Spirit? He who was not afraid to meet Nanak, the polar bear, single-handed. Had she not heard the herders speak in whispers when they told of the Valley of the Good Spirit? Of a certainty, she should be afraid. But somehow she wasn't. She knew she ought to be, for she knew that she was where not even the boldest man in all the great Northland would dare to put his foot. Yet she was not afraid. It must be that the Good Spirit means no harm to little children, thought Tuktu. It must be that the Good Spirit who loves the deer folk loves also little children, or he would not have allowed Whitefoot to bring me here. I wonder what is going on below that wonderful mist. I wonder, oh how I wonder. But if it were meant that I should know, or that anyone should know, that mist would not be there. I guess it is all right to wonder.
But it would be all wrong to try to find out. The deer people are satisfied to stay on these hills, so I will be satisfied. But there must be something very wonderful and very beautiful down there. I wish Aklok were here. He will not believe me when I tell him that I have looked into the Valley of the Good Spirit. My father will not believe me. No one will believe me. Only the deer folk will know. I talked to him looking down in the Valley of the Good Spirit, and no harm has come to me. I think it must be because the spirit of love is here. The deer are rising. I wonder what that means. I must hold fast to Whitefoot, for he must take me home. Whitefoot already had scrambled to his feet. Once more Tuktu climbed on his back. Then Whitefoot began to move toward the upper end of the valley, and Tuktu saw that all the other deer people on both sides were moving in the same direction. End of Chapter 6. Read by Gray Older.
Please subscribe to update new videos. Please share and like if you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much.